Now, everybody, before I start this, let's just set the scene. Just a warning to some people that there are some fairly graphic photos in here. Victorian times were really different, as you can see from the notes there. It was quite normal to touch the dead person. The dead person remained in the house. And some of my humour is coming through here, so honestly, no disrespect intended, just a little bit of sharing of information and telling you where I'm at. So some notes here from the Australian Museum in Sydney, and I guess you've all had time to read those, even down to the fact that children may end up sharing a bed with a dead sibling. So this is one of several of St. Gill's drawings about a funeral parade, service, ceremony. There are several of them, and we could relate this to life on the diggings at Sovereign Hill. Move forward a little bit in time, and here we have Ash and Dawson, this builders and undertakers. And I'm going to refer you here to some of Jude's notes. In this era, people died in hospital. Dying and death, and usually the funeral services will take place at home. The raw timber coffins are made of kauri pine. Most of the coffins have been lined with pitch, tar, sawdust and calico. Bran and sawdust are placed across the bottom of the coffin, and herbs added to further absorb smells, as the body will be lain at home for viewing. To absorb the smell of decay in hot weather, the undertaker puts a bit of charcoal lumps in the casket and sprinkles the layer liberally with permanganate of potash. The rest is up to the household, and that, of course, is where we get all our tradition around candles and flowers. She has the costing notes here for the funeral of Alfred Beasley, aged 5 weeks. To coffin, covered, lined, beaded, £3 10 shillings and 6pence. Hearse with plumes, white, £2 10 shillings and 6pence. Horse plumes, £1 8 shillings and 6pence. Coach and pair, £2. Cemetery fees, 2 and 6. Hat bands, 2 dozen, white, returned, 5 shillings. Gloves, 6 pairs, returned, 5 shillings. Total being £9, 1 and 6. White was a popular colour for the funeral of a child. White gloves, ostrich plumes, and white coffin were the standard. The arrangements for Sarah Fidge, no age given, so presumably adult, cost £7. For a lined beaded coffin, pall, attendants, hearse and plumes, 1½ dozen crepe hat bands and cemetery fees. Now, the funeral shroud. We tend to think of a shroud as being a sheet you wrap a body in. I'd like to share these notes with you. It's from the New York Herald, May 1884, House of Worth. So House of Worth, founded 1858, English gentleman in Paris. And I'll just paraphrase this. Scores of boxes were uncovered to show examples of the present prevailing styles in shrouds. This is a ghastly name, by no means suited to the tasteful burial robes displayed. There was not a hint of winding sheet or cerement in their style. They seemed indeed like a la mode demi-toilettes. One of these, which the reporter saw, folded in its box, was a fine cream-tinted cashmere made like a matinee or tea gown. The front traversed by diagonal folds of satin, the same shade and ruchings and quillings of the same extended from shoulders to the knees. Below were plaited flounces. The sleeves were fully trimmed, and the robe was entirely ready for wear, with fine crepe lissé ruchings at throat and wrists. A carelessly knotted sash of ribbon confined the robe. The cost is only $25. That must have been a lot of money in those days, American dollars, of course. And so my research showed that new brides sewing their trousseau also included a burial shroud, because they knew that many women died in childbirth. And this is a story I'd love to share with you. It'll take just a minute to read. It's from, it's another American one from the Times. It's late Victorian. Out in Anaconda Mont, a rosy, healthy, buxom girl, fresh from her father's ranch, was making some purchases for her approaching wedding. In company with her mother, she entered one of the principal stores of the city. Neither she nor her mother made any secret of the coming wedding or the object of their shopping tour. It was a great event in their lives, and they took the salesman in the general store quite into their confidence. "Now," said Mama, when they had bought a bill that was going to cost Papa many a fat steer, "now we want to look for some nightgowns. We want the very nicest thing you've got." The faithful salesman began to pull down the stock. He exhibited all the prettiest things he could find, but nothing suited. The garments were all too plain and unornamental to suit the demands of the mother and bride-to-be. There are limitations to a Cowtown general store stock, but there are resources as well. The clerk was a man of resources, and when almost at his wit's end, one of his bright ideas came to him. Excusing himself for a moment, he went to another part of the store, rummaged around the boxes, and came back with a gorgeous thing of lace and insertion and filmy fabric. "The very thing," declared Mama. "Why didn't you show that in the first place?" "Well, you see, Mum," he said, "I forgot we had it in stock. We've only got 2 of them. Do you think they will do?" "Do!" exclaimed the girl. "Of course they'll do. They're just what we wanted." So the clerk calmly added 200% to the cost price he found on them, packed the garments in a box, and sent the mother and daughter on their way rejoicing. "Say," said the salesman to the proprietor, when the gentleman came back half an hour later, "I sold them funeral shrouds you got stuck with, sold them to a bride for a trousseau." But the bride never knew. So going back to the other things we find in Ash and Dawson, there's all the accoutrements for the mutes. So the mutes were professional mourners. So for a lady in Victorian times, it would be unbecoming for her to weep and wail. So somebody was duly employed to do that for her. They usually held a broom with mourning crepe draped across it, which was made of the same material as, you're going to love this, baldric, the sash. So now we know where Baldric got his name from. And the colour of the baldric changed. If it was a child, then it would have been in white, and if it was an adult, it was black. The example in Ash and Dawson would have been made from a wooden pole topped with a felloe, which is a section of coach wheel, and harks back to the baronial traditions in Britain, whereas the more common ones were over a broom. And if you look at the long sash, over the years, that was reduced to the armband. Funeral processions. This is one from, it's an Aussie one from the Faulkner crematorium and their records. So there was order in everything in Victorian times. So your position in the funeral depended on your rank. If you were, those obviously closest to the deceased were up closer to the coffin, but also the most important people. And if it was military, sometimes there was a lot of military people in front of the coffin. And the funeral parade could stretch for miles. So as I said, everything is very structured, and there were many of these books instructing you on the correct behaviour. I chose this one because it's by a lady, 1836. The curtains would be drawn, clocks would be stopped at the time of death, mirrors were covered with crepe or veiling to prevent the deceased spirit from getting trapped in the looking glass. A wreath of laurel, yew or boxwood tied with crepe or black ribbons was hung on the front door to alert passersby that a death had occurred. The body was watched over every minute until burial, hence the custom of waking. The wake would also serve as a safeguard from burying someone who was not dead but in a coma. So therefore the wakes lasted 3, 4, 5 days. I'm guessing in Australia, depending on the weather conditions and how far some of the guests would have to travel. The use of flowers and candles, of course, helped mask the unpleasant smells. The dead were carried out feet first in order to prevent the spirit from looking back into the house and beckoning another member of the family to follow. Family photos were also turned face down to prevent any of the close relatives and friends of the deceased from being possessed by the spirit of the dead. Small cakes known as funeral biscuits were wrapped in white paper and sealed with black sealing wax and given to the guests as favours. Lavish meals or collations were often served after interment. And mutes that we talked about earlier, they would spend most of their time outside, posted at the door of the house, and later they walk alongside the hearse. So they were often given gin as compensation against the cold, which leads to a lot of the stories we know about unruly mutes and their behaviour at such solemn occasions. Laying out the body and preparing for burial. When a person died, the body was laid out on a table at home, usually by the women of the household. And so when I'm in the widow Wayne's, I like to have a bit of a joke with people, and I invite them to come in and sit down on the sofa, and then I say, when poor Mr. Wayne passed, you know, he was too long for the table, so we laid him out on the sofa because Mrs. Wayne didn't want to sleep with the dead body, and of course people leap to their feet, and you can have a bit of fun with that. The body was watched over every minute, as we mentioned previously. Viewing and touching the corpse was perfectly acceptable. And sometimes, as mentioned earlier on, kids actually had to sleep with the dead body. And an Irish gentleman once told me about a body being laid out with pennies on the eyes. I didn't get to the bottom of why they have pennies on the eyes. But being a kid who really had money to spend on sweeties, he thought he might souvenir one of the pennies. And when he grabbed it, I don't know, he must have moved some of the roping holding grandfather down, and the body sat up and scared the living daylights out of him. Infant mortality was high. Dysentery, cholera, typhus were the most common causes of death on the goldfields. In the 1850s, 40% of deaths in Victoria were of children under 5. And the causes were most often whooping cough, cholera, fever, flu, teething complications and malnutrition. 80% of baby deaths were from dysentery or diarrhoea. There's a cemetery near Castlemaine called Pennyweight Flat, where 200 children were buried in the 1850s. 200. The main causes of death in Ballarat children between 1853 and 1856, obtained from burial records at the old cemetery, were marasmus, inanition and dentition, often linked with convulsions. So many baby deaths were listed as difficulties at birth. Drowning was also common. Inanition was exhaustion from lack of nourishment. Marasmus was gradual loss of strength from malnutrition, and dentition was teething. Convulsions were caused by fever. Typhoid from contaminated food and water was also common and was known as colonial fever. The Irish wake. Now, thinking about our people down on the diggings, a lot of them were poor Irish. So the Irish, as we know, didn't always conduct themselves with the same dignity that some of our upstanding Victorians in Main Road may have conducted themselves. A little bit here from Charles O'Meara. Irish wakes sometimes became so rowdy that the corpse was taken out of the box and dragged around the dance floor, or a bottle or glass placed in his or her hand, or a hat on the head. Mourners wear black to appear as a shadow rather than a body, so the dead person's spirit won't enter your body. Irish women are in charge of a wake and the funeral preparations. First, all windows are opened and the body is washed and dressed. Also, whiskey is often poured onto the dead person's favourite possessions or things associated with them, such as a bit in their honour. Just a bit in their honour. So the fiddler or a piper might have a bit of whiskey from the toast bottle poured onto his fiddle or pipes. And then we get to the post-mortem photographs. Post-mortem photos taken before the 1860s all have a similar appearance, depicting death as if it just happened, with the body laid out in a bed, apparently sleeping. The person is now at peace. And looking at, you know, the little girl there in white at peace, and her siblings trying very hard to stand still. You can see that the only body that's still in focus is the sadly deceased. And I can't help wondering about these pure white gowns, the funeral shroud, and the stories of from cradle to grave, whether there's some association between the white christening gown and the white shroud. Just one of my little thoughts that I haven't found anything to verify. Now, an American photographer wrote an article in the magazine The Philadelphia Photographer in 1873 with tips for those in the profession. So you can see here we're getting to the time when they're ready to pose the body. To whom it might befall the unpleasant duty to take the picture of a corpse. Place your camera in front of the body, get your plate ready, and then comes the most important part of the operation, opening the eyes. This you can effect handily by using the handle of a teaspoon. Put the lower lids down, they will stay, but the upper lids must be pushed far enough up so they will stay open in about the natural width. Turn the eyeball round to its proper place, and you have a face nearly as natural as life. Proper retouching should remove the blank expression and the stare of the eyes. And so we think we still have, well, we do still have some original Victorian photos in our photographers in Sovereign Hill, and there is at least one of a deceased person. Now we get to the protocol. The stages of mourning were strictly codified and laid out in etiquette books. Women, especially widows, had to observe 3 stages for a set period of time: deep mourning, then second mourning, followed by half mourning. They were considered to need twice as long as men to recover from a death, and their lives were changed drastically, while men returned to life wearing a weeper. They've just put an armband around their arm and got on with it. So you have the poor widow who's in seclusion for 2.5 years. In some cases, she wasn't expected to attend the funeral. In other cases, she was expected to be in a separate room. People weren't supposed to approach her or talk to her. And then when she was allowed out, she had to wear a veil. It was very, very isolating. And I wonder how, here in the early times of Ballarat, some of them managed financially. And we know from records that some of them had to marry within that 2.5 years in order to survive. So I wonder whether they had to wear their widow's weeds to marry. I'm not sure how all that worked, but something to ponder. Right. Unlike current times where anyone can attend a funeral service, in the Victorian age, a person must first wait to receive their formal written invitation. It was not proper, however, to send invitations to the funeral of a person who died from contagious disease, just a simple notice. So funeral guests were expected to arrive precisely an hour before the service was to begin. When they entered the house of the deceased, men were expected to remove their hats and not replace them again while in the house. Loud talking and laughter were also strictly forbidden, and interviews with the family at that time should not be expected. We're getting to the time where you've got these beautiful embossed cards. They can actually print them with photograph if you've got lots of money. If not, you've got a DIY where you just fill in your own details, fill the gap. But and I wonder what the Criterion store carried. The picture on my right is the warehouse at Jay's, and that was more or less the beginning of off-the-rack clothing, because you had to get your mourning gear quite quickly, and you had to do everything right. Widow's weeds. So weeds is just an old word for garments. Widow's weeds. For women during the Victorian period, mourning attire included every conceivable article of clothing, as well as hair accessories, stationery, umbrellas, fans, purses, tableware, crockery, and other household objects. Men, a black handbag or an armband, or they could change the colour of the gloves. The material most associated with mourning was black silk crepe or bombazine, which was almost exclusively manufactured by one company, hence they had the monopoly. So basically it had to be a black fabric that didn't reflect the light at all. Wearing coloured or flattering clothes was considered callous and even immoral. But when you got all this gear, it was considered unlucky to have crepe in the house after the prescribed period of mourning, because that brings bad luck. So then all of that had to be burnt and repurchased the next time somebody died. In Australia, of course, funerals were less extravagant, and I've got this nice little article from a story called A Bunyip Close Behind Me. It was some time before we grasped the fact that father was dead. Snivelling a little, we crept out and found mother and auntie in the laundry, where they were poling with long sticks, a copper full of black dye, into which every garment mother possessed, with the possible exception of her corsets, had just been thrown. So then you just dyed everything black. And this shows some of the accessories that I mentioned earlier. The middle picture is a French catalogue. I think the pictures on the left are English. Whoops, gone to the next one. Let's go back. The way I've got my screen, I've got your pictures over the other two. But the other two pictures in the corner, one, would you believe, is mourning pins. There are pins there for your garments that are in, yeah, and it's a decorative comb if you can't see it. Bonnets, I included these for the bonnet makers. Now, it was Queen Victoria who started popularising the hair in the jewellery, so human hair was used, and then you wore it. And if you look at how intricately that bracelet, that snake bracelet, is woven, they're really quite clever. And Vicky Moss will remember we learned about hair receivers, which was a container that Mum kept on her dressing table. So any spare hair that came out of your hairbrush could be stored in a hair receiver and used for a hairpiece to do your own hair or for such wonderful. And here we have some jet jewellery. So Whitby jet is considered the finest jet in the world. It's fossilised remains that's turned into an organic gemstone, and it's from the monkey puzzle tree from Whitby. Whitby, incidentally, is the place that Captain Cook sailed from for his expeditions in 1770. And the one in the middle there, you can see the combination of using the hair, the jet, and the photograph in the jewellery. We've got some really nice examples of Victorian jewellery across at the Gold Museum, and those of us who were lucky enough to attend the Bling exhibition at the Eureka Centre, some of the pieces they had there were absolutely amazing. Seed pearls, They were for tears. This bracelet, once again, is a hair bracelet. And full ensembles. So if you had the money, you could go all the way. It's well recognised that here in Ballarat we had the finest, purest gold in Australia, and so the Mourning jewellery in Australia started to reflect that, and we started to have Australian flora and fauna decorating our jewellery. And now we get to what I consider somewhat pointless Victorian photography, given how expensive it was to have your photo taken, but obviously people did, and they wanted you to know that they were very, very sad and in mourning, and so it is duly reflected. But given all the tradition, the pomp, how precise funerals were, here we have the body of Dan Morgan. He wasn't afforded any such respect. He was shot, his wounds weren't treated, they took him to the wool shed so everybody could view his body. And if you suicided, no, you couldn't be buried in a consecrated grave. If you hadn't been baptised, no, you didn't have the right to be buried in a churchyard. Think of Thomas Hardy, Tess of the Dirt. Yes, Tess, good old Tess. If we think about Tess's baby, you know, Tess was raped. She had a baby out of wedlock, so the poor little bastard couldn't be buried in the churchyard. She called him Sorrow, and she had to bury him outside the cemetery. And we talk about all this respect and how things had to be correct in Victorian times, and yet we took Aboriginal remains and we shipped them back to England to exhibit in our museums. Grave robbers, of course, had a field day. Doctors needed bodies to dissect, to learn from, but there was plenty to be found in grave robbings, and there's some really good stories about prostitutes in some of the seedier parts in London being extremely well dressed. And I think that concludes my presentation.